Welcome, dear people, to Osei Nation with Marilynn Stark. This is Marilynn, and today's podcast will concern the interview of President Zelenskyy in the Fridman podcast of January 5th. This podcast today will highlight some of the points President Zelenskyy mentions as he talks about his personal knowledge of war, since World War II had so greatly affected his family, and since his grandfather was a World War II veteran. Zelenskyy, in a very personable way, speaks about how he leads the people through the current Russo-Ukrainian war, the hopes he holds in workable peace talks, first with President-elect Trump, and then ultimately with the unspeakable President Putin. Some of the history of the civic unrest Ukraine has known before the all-out invasion by Russia in 2022 is also recounted. Let us begin. In passing, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says the city of Odessa is quite distinctive, and the people there speak their own accent, and also they are very Ukrainian. He further says that he goes to Odessa several times a year because of the question of air defense systems needing to be strengthened there, because of the grain corridor and such things. Further, Zelenskyy says of Odessa, "They have the sun, they have the sea." Zelenskyy also speaks of the Rome Statute, while mentioning Putin in an everyday context of conversation with the host of the 3-hour-long podcast, Fridman. For reference, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, is the treaty that founded the ICC. Adopted in Rome on the 17th of July, 1998, it entered into force on the 1st of July in 2002. There are currently 125 states as of late 2024, states that belong to the ICC. The ICC defines the framework for prosecuting war crimes. Zelenskyy mentions to Fridman that the ICC is not yet accepted by the American government. The Ukrainian president recounts the story of his grandfather who fought in World War II. His grandfather graduated from the military academy. He fought in the infantry, having fought through the entire war from the very beginning to the end. He had more than 30 wounds from the war. President Zelenskyy relates to us that he loved his grandfather totally, and they were very close. His grandfather, a serious-minded man, never really talked about the war, regarding it rather as a tragedy, a great tragedy for all. Ukraine, of course, was occupied by USSR. Zelenskyy's great-grandfather, the head of the village, was also shot by the fascists. Zelenskyy, moreover, reports that there was a mass grave there in his village, and some people were buried alive. Zelenskyy's grandfather married a fine lady when he returned home from the war, facing no remaining family people of his own. His wife operated an orphanage for war orphans. His grandfather did police work after the war, and thus he fought for justice all his life. The whole Zelenskyy family, including his grandfather, both of his grandmothers, and his parents, lived together in an apartment. Both grandmothers had lost their husbands in the war. President Zelenskyy points out that none of his elders left him an inheritance, but rather they taught him values and respect. Mr. Fridman speaks also of having lost many of his family members in World War II. He visited the place where they died on the day before he interviewed Zelenskyy for the podcast. Fridman says he remembers a song from his youth. Quote, "On June 22nd at 4 o'clock, Kiev was bombed and the war began." End of quote. This was part of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when 3.8 million Axis troops initiated the massive invasion of the USSR. It is the largest military incursion recorded in all of history. Remember, 3.8 million Axis troops. The podcast text box goes on to relate, on February 24th, 2022, at 4 a.m., Russian forces invaded Ukraine. Zelenskyy states that Kyiv in 2022 indeed was bombed, for sure, but that the war had already started before that, years before in 2014. He was referring to the Russian promulgated war in Donbass that began on February 27, 2014. In brief summary, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and parts of 4 southeast oblasts in 2022: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. This can be described as more of a clandestine operation by Russian troops, and they sympathized incognito with separatists, providing troops and materiel. This prevented Ukraine from fully retaking its own territory. Many people were up in arms about President Viktor Yanukovych having postponed the signing of the Ukraine-EU Association Agreement. For 3 months, far-right political dissenters held public protests collectively known as the Euromaidan, ultimately falling prey to Russian infiltrators who camouflaged the protest and essentially turned this part of Ukraine into an anti-Russia partition. The dissenters wanted a new constitution. They were dissatisfied with the pro-Russo President Yanukovych. Violence struck ultimately, even though Yanukovych had refused to implement weapons against protesters by police. This was also the exhortation of both the UK and the United States. It was on the 20th of February 2014 when some incognito armed contenders started to fire shots at protesters and police from behind. This violence is now known as Bloody Thursday. Such a sudden attack out of the blue has occurred in recent modern history in other places of marked civic unrest. This takes the moment categorically out of the realm of coincidence, does it most patently not? The same thing where unknown shooters shift from a vector of peace to violence against the grain of any truce was witnessed in Vilnius, Lithuania, 1991, Caracas, Venezuela, in 2002, Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, in 2001, Cairo, Egypt, in 2013, and also in Syria, Libya, and so forth. In that unknown shooter event in Ukraine, people lost their lives on both sides. People upon whom such a triangulation of discontent, although hidden, had been mysteriously co-opted away from the very peace for which they had negotiated. And this case has never been solved. In short, Yanukovych fled for his life and went to Russia so that the world had indeed witnessed a situation much like a coup d'état wherein power was ceded, that of the presidency, outside, at any rate, of the newer Ukrainian constitutional writ. The Constitution of Ukraine rather stipulates that a change in presidential office would occur by election. But the parliament had sanctified the restoration of the 2004 Constitution of Ukraine, and in so doing, it quickly took legislative measures to end the Yanukovych rule. Alexander Turchinov was then elected as acting president. This sums up, in short, the political divides that Zelenskyy inherited when he took office in May of 2019. In his in-depth discussion, Zelenskyy regrets the fact that in previous years, in his communication with Washington, his pleas for help well before the actual invasion by Russia of Ukraine in 2022 were not given proper, adherent attention. Indeed, Zelenskyy, with a certain measure of prescience, had pleaded for help from the United States. This would have been help in the form of sanctions on Russia so as to prevent an invasion. Second to this, he had asked for weapons. Zelenskyy states that instead of anything concrete in response to his pleas to the U.S., as one might expect, with Russian troops dancing on Ukraine's border in the months before the invasion, Zelenskyy instead received just words. After all, Zelenskyy, alongside the rest of the eyes of the world, was watching Russian troops exercising on the Belarus-Ukraine border. According to Al Jazeera, these troops arrived in Belarus in mid-October. Zelenskyy was proposing to Washington to keep peace through strength, the strength of sanctions on Russia. As for the question of weapons, ultimately, Zelenskyy showed nerves of steel once the missiles struck Ukraine in his famous statement. When offered an evacuation by the United States, he retorted, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride," according to CNN. With reasonable dispatch, Zelenskyy went out to the street and made a brief statement to the people of Ukraine. To his people, he said, "I am here," meaning he had not left Kyiv. He then went on to say, "We are not putting down arms. We will be defending our country because our weapon is truth, and our truth is that this is our land, our country, our children, and we will defend all of this." The Russians were trying to spread false information that Zelenskyy had fled the country indeed. Zelenskyy bravely went out to the street and gave the people the patent truth. Incidentally, just after the initial missile strikes heard by Zelenskyy and his wife at about 4 a.m, he said he spoke with President Lukashenko of Belarus on the phone. That president apologized to Zelenskyy, saying that it was not he himself who had attacked, that missiles were launched from his territory, and that Putin was the culprit. Zelenskyy then remarked to Lukashenko that he, as leader of Belarus, was a murderer too. Zelenskyy nailed him with his inherent responsibility in allowing missiles to be launched from his land. Lukashenko answered, "All right, then retaliate." Besides getting food to cities in Ukraine that were blocked once the war struck, the powers that be who worked with President Zelenskyy immediately in the aftermath of the shocking truth of Russia's unlawful militant aggression felt it necessary to arm the people. Henceforth, they distributed actual weapons to people so that they could defend the capital. Zelenskyy, as he recounts the situation at hand, cites the vital fact that the digitalization that his administration had was thankfully of a high caliber. This allowed the Zelenskyy administration to deal with other cities as according to the information they received, vis-a-vis if such cities were also surrounded by Russians. He says that even before the violence of Russia struck, Ukraine had developed a good digitalization. This meant that even in the face of the possible destabilization presented by war, many things still worked: the banking system, the internet, and television. It was from these utilities that Zelenskyy summoned his leadership capabilities to make certain, as he put it, quote, that people were united and have all the information. Russia is very good at spreading false information, end of quote. He goes on to say, "Fortunately, I have 2 decades of experience managing a production studio, TV channels, and large media resources. I understood that we needed to build a large information network very quickly. Thanks to this, I began to address the people constantly, This happened 3 to 5 times a day. In this way, if a city was cut off from other information, Zelenskyy himself became their exact personal information source. It was a vital priority in importance, Zelenskyy recognized, that the people trust his Center for Truthful Information. They built an information platform called Marathon. This was a media platform that was the conglomerate of all the news agencies of Ukraine. In fact, as the initial warring moments expressed, there were waves of Russian disinformation that claimed wrongly, as I said, that Zelenskyy had left Ukraine. Zelenskyy describes Putin as deaf when anyone might speak to him. Further, quote, "He is different. A mammoth stands before you," end of quote. In contrast, Ukraine's leader in this war speaks well of Trump. He says he loves President Trump's message when he speaks. "I think that we share a position on peace through strength," end of quote. Zelenskyy's poetic portrayal of Putin I find to be astute. He says that he lives on being subjectivized. That is, this demented leader is called into the limelight to give forth his subjective self. He is expected to step out into the light, yet he is one hunk of darkness itself. You see, Zelenskyy sees in and through Putin, knowing that Putin simply does not want to end the war. Zelenskyy thinks that Trump is good for the task ahead, in that Trump has enough power, not so much as to look for the will in Putin to stop the war, but instead to skillfully apply pressure on Putin to actually stop the war. From the foregoing, one can gain a picture of the astute, courageous president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and how his family background, with its experience during World War II, affected him in his youth. In reality, he became war-savvy, as he saw the results of the war reflect into his family, both in the tragic losses of family members and in the counterbalancing to those losses as reflected to him by the survivors. Most notably, it can be inferred that the example set by his grandfather, a war veteran turned police officer, always fighting for justice and the rule of law, had made an indelible impression on the future president. One gains a sense of courage when one's elders teach courage by example. Today, therefore, those of us who believe in democracy, who believe in humanity itself, must indeed esteem the President of Ukraine, who in a knowing way leads the people through the unfortunate warring grip of the cruel tyrant Putin. In Zelenskyy and in his military, as well as in the keenly brave Ukrainian people, the entire free world must rally to find an actual inchoate template for the way to preserve our way of life, our very way of life. We, in coming to the aid of Ukraine in the Russo-Ukrainian war, by whatever measure we can muster, nation by nation, broadcaster by broadcaster, and even volunteer by volunteer, can mold that template now in its beginning stages, for it is a template upon whose example we may mold a new paradigm for the continuation of liberty itself, whilst knowing that in justice liberty lives. Yes, we can all pray for the sovereignty of the nation of Ukraine. We can herald the mandate of our own President-elect Trump as he works to nobly address the vitally urgent circumstances in which Ukraine courageously carries on. They are the circumstances of an innocent nation having been unlawfully invaded by a nuclear power, Russia, many times its size. Before closing, however, there is likely no individual from the West who can know President Putin more astutely than President Zelenskyy. What President Zelenskyy relates in this fine Lex Fridman podcast to us is an urgent truth. A truth about Putin. Putin is Hitlerian. He is an absolutist. He absolutely will not relent in his will to re-establish a Russian empire. In 2019, Zelenskyy, Merkel, Putin, and Macron met in France, in Paris, Normandy, on the 9th of December. There was discussion of a ceasefire. When that ceasefire did not succeed, this was no surprise to Zelenskyy. On the contrary, President Zelenskyy had seen the dense mind of Putin, who seemed to be deaf to any real, sincere idea of making peace at all. Even during the talks, Zelenskyy recalls that Putin would stop the hopes in a not-so-subtle way during discussions, when he would play dumb. At one point, for instance, amidst talks about making peace, Putin cutely interjected, "What border?" Furthermore, in this Lex Fridman podcast, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy expresses his understanding of our President Trump. He understands the position in which Trump finds himself. Indeed, the clarity of Zelenskyy's mind should lend a certain facility to the intensely important task that lies ahead for the two leaders on behalf of world peace. That is my estimate in a few words. We of both camps, NATO nations and Ukraine, are in the best of hands. May God bless Ukraine. May God bless the West and freedom of the individual forevermore. Thank you.